I was going to go grab a little bite to eat, ended up going to get a beer. So beer is dinner. I'm enjoying a Samuel Adams Belgian session.
Why fusion?
I wanted to do fusion, but recall most of my work has been in plasma radiation sources and then in cold plasmas. I've only recently been active professionally in looking at things like polywell as fusion systems and helping to support the focus fusion activity. So those are my two forays into fusion as real active research. I was always a cheerleader and always had some connection through various activities at NRL into the fusion community. Mostly my research was in plasma radiation sources. Mostly those with Z-pinches, and Z-pinches long ago thrust aside in the spectrum of fusion machines because they're just too Rayleigh-Taylor or unstable. My actual serious concentration in fusion is a recent thing.
So you've had a long career in plasma physics. You worked at NRL, you worked at Jaycor in the 80s. You've been a consultant for a number of years. If you look back on that career, what are you most proud of?
I was pleased to work a lot with Sandia on Z-pinch. It was probably some of the best work for me. So a long-standing collaboration with Sandia and collaboration with some of the better simulation codes in pulse power plasmas. Found that very satisfying. Well, there's a lot of little stuff. Lots of little things that worked well. Paper out on plasma instability, which revolves around what people often call a polarization drift, or actually instability is based on E cross V drifts in a plasma which is collapsing. And I may go back to that, looking for folks interested to pursue that a little further, but looking at the polywell seriously with an idea of changing it and helping out the dense plasma focus, trying to understand it. It's a lot more complicated than you might think. There's a lot of basic understanding to be developed. So I'm pleased that I got a lot of contacts. I had a couple of nice highlights in terms of the plasma science. I actually am probably more pleased with my career as a DARPA investigator. There I was closer to experiment, and actually money didn't work out. But it was a very interesting project, which I'm still constrained not to talk about. So what can I say? But it was fun.
Right. Of course. You talked about dense plasma focus. When I think about dense plasma focus, I think about the mechanism that is always put forward. And I want you to stop me when I get this wrong. You have a sheet of plasma that's formed between the electrodes. The sheet moves up to a certain location, and then it's supposed to fall apart into a whole collection of fibers that then turn into a dense ball, and then there's supposed to be an array of material going out one way and an array of material going out the other way, and at that time it's dense enough that there's fusion. That's what I understand it to be. What do you think about that? Can you poke holes in that? Do you disagree? What do you think?
That's roughly accurate. Doesn't have to be too much more than roughly accurate because a lot of these details are unprobed. They're really unprobed in terms of extremely fine diagnostics to confirm or deny whether those mechanisms really obtain. Yes, there are beams coming out. Yes, there are ways of imagining the braids of plasma to kink up and make little knots and form into tight plasmoids. And yes, there are potential solutions. There's no particular simulation or analytic theory that really connects all the dots quite yet. It's a working hypothesis, and you've stated it reasonably well. But fundamentally, the sheet comes down. There's a filamentation instability that is going to operate in that sheet to tend to make it into filaments. Some workers want to try and optimize the creation of filaments and optimize how run down the machine and run into each other. If you can control the number of filaments, control the number of ways they interact, then maybe have a little better picture of what you're going to do. But the detailed understanding of what actually is happening in there in terms of experiment is not there yet. It's a matter of time and money. A lot of people would like to see a more detailed confirmation about what is actually going on. In the Z-pinch world, there's like a Pies-Brzezinski collapse. And what goes on with the little nuggets of plasma focus is akin to the Pease-Brzezinski collapse in that little bits of radiation can let the thing collapse. But for the Z-pinch and the radiative result, you wanted the radiation. You would hope to excite a Pease-Brzezinski collapse because you'd get a lot of radiation out. In a dense plasma focus, you want to keep the impurities lower and lower and lower so that it doesn't have radiation. Then it can excite thermonuclear fusion. It's just a trade between how the energy gets out. Exactly how that goes is a very interesting question. It might be different or it might be very similar. DPF put out a paper in the 27th Symposium on Plasma Physics and Technology there in Austria, and has some very good results in the microcosm of how to get impurities down and how to get a little better yield and how to get a little tighter spread on what the yield is. Those are the primary things. But we're not there yet. I think everybody would agree.
The problem with getting all those questions answered, it takes money and it takes people and it takes equipment and it takes collaborators. It takes multiple groups that are looking at the same question from different angles. So you've seen both sides of this. You've seen communities of plasma physicists where that was happening and then these other groups where that's not happening. And why do you think one group receives a lot of resources and another group doesn't?
Well, there are good reasons and bad reasons about that. Bad reasons involve transparent cutthroat competition and transparent political manipulation in Washington. Sometimes there are good reasons that people don't communicate or collaborate as richly as they could because they want to keep certain threads of the activity proprietary. Well, you look at Lockheed Martin now and what they're doing in the skunk works. They have more resources perhaps than other people in compact fusion reactors, and they're going to be very guarded in their collaboration, but they're doing that for most venture capitalists would consider good reasons as opposed to not doing it because politics. I mean, the history of NIF is a perfect history of how not to approach that kind of effort, in my view. Don't get me started. But it's not that there are no bright spots. There are some extremely good bright spots in the little nitty-gritty and some of the very good diagnostics they've had. But when it comes to what's actually there in front of you in the laboratory, and then this relates to a program goal, there's been a lot of creative hyperbole. Creative hyperbole is not what you want when you're trying to do a complicated, difficult problem like fusion. But in fusion, you may never know, because if you monkey around and play fast and loose with the truth, you just won't get accurate.
What do you think we need to do collectively, or is there a set of things we can do to try to encourage fusion research right now?
Most of the questions revolve around the same problems: time, money, and people. There are more people than there might used to be in terms of aggressive and new and different ways of going about fusion. There are people who are looking at it freshly in your generation, and still some folks in my generation who are willing to take fresh looks at old stuff and fresh looks at new stuff. Try to just come up with things that haven't been seen before. So the intellectual capital is strong. The financial capital is suffering from the same problem we've suffered from for the last 50 years. We have spent monotonically less money in real dollars on physical science research. Like I said in a talk recently, when you look at that track record and you're sitting there looking at what I have to characterize as the single greatest failure of American physics in the 20th century, namely production of controlled thermonuclear fusion. Quibble about details, but there are two systems that produce noticeable thermonuclear yield, and neither of them is very helpful for an earthbound reactor. Right? So far, we don't have anything other than stars and bombs that does much in the way of fusion. So why is that? That's a very interesting historical question. The physical capital is there, but still weak, and there's no focus for it. Move into private capital or public-private ventures. I'm looking to find ways to take aggressive investments, try to get aggressive science results. Got high-risk money and high-risk research. You might as well put the two together. Still haven't found the best financial partners for that yet, but I'm poking at it.
You've seen public interest kind of come up and come down, and looking back on it, are there any major mistakes that we made as a field, things that we should probably do different going forward? And
Honestly, I don't think that we can afford the luxury of having people at DOE kind of decide that they can predict the course of research and people at NASA trying to do the same thing. That's one of the major mistakes that was made and still continues to be made. NASA actually has such an infatuation with fusion as an energy source that it's almost impossible to get any in-space propulsion project going with NASA if it does not involve the promise of fusion in the engine. And they're even so bold as to place on their long-term planning charts dates certain when fusion is going to be available as a technology. They have two of them. They have early fusion, and they put it on the chart, and they have high fusion. They have actually put that on charts. And it's PowerPoint engineering, and they do know that it's funny, but want fusion to be in that mix is a way to help justify in-space propulsion. But is it easier to make a fusion rocket where it has to be compact and it has to be safe and it has to be transportable compared to a fusion power reactor? You can live with it being huge if you have to. Then things like P-boron 11 fuel cycles are always very exciting, but very difficult. There are lots of reasons why this notion of being able to lay out a plan and have that plan look like something that an MBA can wrap his mind around. This is not a problem that an MBA can wrap his mind around. There are two things they don't want to recognize. They don't want to recognize that redundancy is a feature, and they don't want to recognize that you can't likely cost estimate these things better than a factor 2. And so it just drives public funding people and some of the business types crazy. They don't understand, and they fight against it. And they try and make you do things that aren't scientifically viable or sensible. So how do you bridge that gap? If we could find a way to bridge that gap between fusion, it's like building a new car. But no, it's not. This is not like building a new car. Going to Mars is like building a new car. We got all the technologies to go to Mars. We don't know what the technology is to create a viable fusion reactor. So fusion is a more difficult problem than Mars. Even going to Mars suffers from the same bureaucratic miasma about trying to overplan and that you can actually predict what's going to do it. So you want to find collaborative groups that take the broadest possible scope. If I want to do fusion, like something like a polywell, I don't want to sit there and exclude things like the DPF or the stellarate or the crashing compact torates. None of those things should be excluded. And that's where we went wrong back in the mid-'80s. They down-selected to two major concepts, and that was the dumbest thing I could imagine. When I was watching these people in the fusion program just weeping in the hallway, there was a lot of beer going down. Because DOA just came to the APS meeting mid-'80s, and they said, okay, we're down-selecting to inertial confinement fusion and tokamak. And all you other guys can go pound sand. And it was just that abrupt. And that was the dumbest thing possible. And now it's 30 years later, and we're finally going back and picking up the pieces. So why did we have to pick up the pieces? The thing we should have known is that you can't predict the course of research. You need to bring the money up to the point where you can do a credible job smoothly assessing all of these things and encourage the groups to take the widest scope in things like numerical support, for example. There's a rule that says you build code for federal tax dollars and the taxpayer owns that code. Well, the fact of the matter is that people build code for federal research all the time, and the taxpayer never gets control of that source code. Never. And so you find all these little patchworks of code that build up in one contract or another, and that's just one little way where this same cancer plays havoc with your technique. So we need to get around that kind of problem. We need to have a broad collaboration across the various technologies of fusion. If you had that broad collaboration, if you had that commitment from DOE to encourage the widest spectrum of pathways and let everybody talk to each other, keep in common every possible thing you could rationally keep in common. Equations of state, basic techniques of simulation across all kinds of plasma. So those are the things I think would help. We have to really take that this wants to be a broadly based intellectual effort.
You talked a great deal about where the science meets the government bureaucracy. The Department of Energy has an Office of Fusion Energy Sciences, and the ICF budget comes from DoD. They get about $500 million apiece. Recently, Representative Alan Grayson has been trying to get a bill through Congress called the Fusion Innovation Act. He introduced one back in August, and then he reintroduced it again in March, and he had a hand in starting a hearing on fusion in April. You're used to the DC environment. Do you think that the DOE has to be restructured? Do you think it would be a new agency? Do you think it would go through ARPA-E? Do you think there needs to be a shakeup at FES? Do you have any thoughts on that?
And having observed them as a customer and a participant for some 35 years, I don't think that the bureaucracy will change itself. On the other hand, there is a grave danger that if you come to the top of the bureaucracy with a bad idea, that you'll actually get the bureaucracy to make progress with a bad idea. You're between a rock and a hard place. You have to bring this new thinking out of people actually involved in the work, and you have to encourage them to change their way of thinking. Encourage them to change the way they look at how their results are to be shared. A lot of universities have been fighting for funding so long, they're highly competitive. It's like 10 rats in a bag with food for 2 rats. And it's been that way for a long time. So you have to have a means of changing the structure, but then letting the players understand how to rearrange their thinking to make use of that structure. It's not a bottom up and it's not a top down. It's a very organic change that has to occur. I think it could be helped by the infusion of more private money. Just like Mars One is going out to billionaires across the planet saying, hey, help me go to Mars. There's no reason that fusion entrepreneurs should not go to billionaires across the planet. If you encourage the technology transfer in the large track programs, both databases and code techniques and all this kind of thing to be pooled and understood and cultivated as a common resource, private-public capital might actually get the leverage to help that happen. And that's the way I see it. It's a matter of trying to encourage the right organization in addition to getting the science. If you get an innovation in fusion concepts, and that can come at any time from anybody, then that innovation might be the seed crystal to help bring all this together. Or it might be snuffed out by the other 8 rats bag with you.
That's very insightful. You can really see that. You're talking about metrics. Tokamaks aren't close to net power, and ICF isn't close to net power. And I feel like fusion has lost its meter stick, its metrics. The NIF it loses about 200 units of energy for every 1 laser unit, a Q of basically 1%.
Right, and you want 10.
Or 1, at least break even, not even close to break even.
Yeah. Well, if you only have 1, you won't be wall plugged break even. And last I talked with the guys at NIF, came through on a power play back last year here in Washington. They had a team because they said they had break even, and they published a paper about it being break even. Turns out that wasn't break even. That was just exothermicity. I think they documented exothermicity, that they had real fusion energy coming out. But to call it break even, and the Philosophical Society of Washington, I questioned them from the floor. And we agreed they were basically a factor of 10,000 away from wall plug break even. And I said, isn't this a little bit worse? And they had to just shut up and take it. And that's inertial confinement side of the house. I think the tokamak side of the house is 1,000 or so for break even. But, things like the polywell aren't noticeably better. Polywells have a long way to go before they even come to the point where you've got something that looks like a testable, configurable reactor. Is there anything in the polywell spectrum you know of?
No. The polywell is still a research concept, and it might not work. There are a lot of unknowns, a lot of question marks. We only had one paper that claimed that it even got fusion with a polywell, and that was Bassard's paper. And I read the paper, and it's terribly written. So no, the polywell is a research concept at this point, along with a lot of other research concepts.
So the way it is, I think you want these little ideas like polywell and stellarator. Stellators, it's a very potentially useful reactor concept. Very delicate engineering in the stellarator. But as I said in this little talk I gave at Multicon, basically the things that work have del dot something is not zero. And all the things in magnetic confinement, del dot B is always zero. So there's nothing about magnetic fields that tends to force a focused implosion like gravity or like shock waves or like electrostatics. So Stellarator is this marvelous piece of engineering where they take the details of the magnetic field and they work on them and they work. It's possibly that only German technology is up to the task of being so precise and so steadfast and so tenacious. But I think the Stellarator is a beautiful concept and could well work.
So just finally, do you have anything that you want to add that we didn't talk about?
This notion of a commonality of resources and of intellectual capital and a willingness to collaborate as much as possible on things that are common to the fusion problem. I think that's central because that helps the people who are maybe investors in a fusion scheme or taxpayers or people who are contributing to the foundation to help this kind of research. It helps them understand the problem. When you went on a short funding cycle and you went before Congress all the time, you don't want to talk about how difficult the problem is. Because when you're doing that in front of MBAs and congressfolk and you're telling them that there may be no end in sight, they're going to say, oh, yes, there's an end in sight. You're not going to like it, but there's an end in sight. We don't have a mechanism for long-term funding and long-term investment and long-term thinking about how to approach difficult problems like this. Climate is the same kind of thing, except climate mercifully is slower to develop. Energy crisis is faster to develop than some of the climate consequences. And so we're looking for energy to keep things running as we like them and to do better. And fusion would certainly produce that, certainly produce tens of thousands of times the energy that we see just in normal kilowatt hours per kilogram. P411 is one of the marvelous things we can use for fusion fuel. I mean, you bring something like P411 up, you've solved a huge problem. But it's kind of a nice example of how you can paint over something which is a real showstopper if you weren't ready for it. People who advocate for P411, they don't have a fusion reactor. Maybe it's going to be a polywell, maybe it's going to be a DPF. And there's this fusion reactor, and it's cranking out P411 energy, and there's a guy standing next to it. Now, it turns out there's a side channel, a very nasty 15 MeV gamma ray that comes out. And this thing has a branching ratio 10 to the minus 4 or something. But even with that small branching ratio, by the time you've got break-even power coming out of your P411, you're roasting anybody in the vicinity with lethal doses of this gamma ray. This gamma ray is going to roast you alive if you're not careful. It's an easy problem. Shield it with water. Have some jacket of water or polyethylene or something that's going to interact with this gamma ray and keep it under control. It's just the sort of thing where the devil is truly in the detail. And when you go to the public and you try to portray what the technology is going to look like and what you can do with it, you have to be honest about it, take the good with the bad, and say there are going to be some issues.
All right, well, I think that about covers it, unless you have something else.
I'm ready to go get another beer. Maybe the next one will be a Guinness. Anyway, it's a pleasure, Matt, as always.
All right, we'll talk later. It's nice talking to you tonight.